The most compelling way to engage a business audience is to use stories. We are wired for story. It's in our DNA. Stories are how our ancestors learned about and made sense of the world around the campfire and oral tradition and in the great religious and wisdom texts. In business, we use stories to get our audience's attention and to keep it. Tell a better story for better business results. Yet our personal stories, they can sabotage our business goals. We relive our past mistakes and failures through mental stories. We tell ourselves stories about a future that hasn't happened, a future we most often do not want to experience. So what stories are you telling yourself about your past, present, and future that are holding you back? I want you to learn new skills to rewrite the stories you tell yourself, so you step through your days with more confidence and ease, and create a business life and career full of great stories you'll want to share and relive someday. Join me as we go on a mission to rewrite the stories that don't serve us in this episode of The Business of Being. This is The Business of Being, a podcast about the intersection of life and business, how the inner work of being prepares us for the outer work of doing and succeeding. I'm your host, Stephen Megling. My guest today is Dave Robinson. Dave is a level 3 master story worker and healthy holistics habits coach for men. Dave is someone who helps you to get fit on the outside and the inside. He's a no BS dude, and Dave has a heart of gold. You're going to want to return to this podcast discussion over and over because Dave will step you through how to reclaim the stories you've been telling yourself, so you heal those old stories and emerge whole and complete. Stick around after our discussion. I'll share with you the 3 biggest stress stories we tell ourselves. So Dave, welcome.
Glad to be here, my friend.
Looking forward to this conversation. And as I was designing this first season of the podcast, I knew I wanted to talk about stories, specifically the stories that we tell ourselves. And even more specific than that, the stories that we tell ourselves that could be setting us back, holding us back. And I couldn't think of a better person to have this conversation with than you.
Thrilled to be here. Stories are my world.
That sounds good. And just because this is an audio-only podcast, I just want to set the scene here. So for the last year and a half, Dave has been rocking this grizzly man beard, this thing that is in a different time zone. It's so long and so deep.
It should have its own Instagram account, pretty much. But
Dave's beard, wisdom from Dave's beard. And yet Dave walked into the podcast booth today, fairly clean shaven, but you're rocking the stash now. So I'm having some moment here. Just bear with me. I'm trying to regather my thoughts here as we're talking.
You are talking to Dave. We're the same guy, sans beard. I know it's a different look.
I'm sorry. The invitation was for Dave's beard, not Dave's mustache. So let me know when Dave's beard is available. All right. I tease. All right. Let's get into the seriousness, because this is a great conversation to have, because I think stories can hold us back and they can free us. And I want to see how we can navigate that freedom route today. But the first question, I think, is probably a yes or no, but maybe you can elaborate on how you answer. First question I have is, it seems like most of us think just because we have a thought, it must be true. Is it?
No. Simple answer, no. Complex answer, it depends, maybe. Soft-talk acknowledged. When we talk about stories, I think it's important to get the context of what we're talking about here. We're talking about the internal and external dialogue that individuals have on a regular basis. And that internal-external dialogue is happening regardless of whether we're thinking about it or not. Right? The average person can't go more than about 3 seconds without a thought. And so you are speaking to yourself when you are thinking. You are obviously speaking when you're speaking out loud, right? We have to assume that some of those things that we think about or say to ourselves or tell ourselves, some of the stories we tell ourselves, have to be false. They can't all be true, right? And many of the most impactful ones are false, oftentimes.
I'm glad you shared all of that and you gave the short and sweet answer and then elaborated on it. And the reason for me asking such a simple question is I want to make sure our listeners, we're all on the same page, that we have a basic, fundamental first principle on this conversation about the stories that we tell ourselves. And the stories that we tell ourselves are the thoughts that we have, the internal monologue, and as you said, the external monologue, both what we say out loud as well as what other people say to us. So I just wanted to make sure that we all are there together before we take the next leap forward. So I'm hearing you say, yeah, just because you have a thought doesn't make it true. And hopefully those of you listening are saying, of course I know that. Of course. I hope you've graduated to that level of consciousness to just simply be aware that just because you have a thought doesn't make it true. The challenge that I run into and the challenge that I think most of us do in a business context or otherwise is that when we have a stressful thought, and that's really the litmus test here, stressful, because it creates emotion, sometimes immediate hardcore emotion, sometimes like a low-grade pain or ache. I think it stops us from even just pausing and asking, is this true? Has that been your experience in the work that you've done with others?
Yeah, and the stressful thoughts are the most impactful ones oftentimes. And what makes something stressful? Well, it's the response that happens in the body, right? Stress is a byproduct of the fight or flight sympathetic nervous system response. And so if, I can talk myself, I can think myself, I can definitely run myself, into a stressed state. If I go run for the next 5 hours, I'm going to be stressed out. If I sit here and say, I hate myself, 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 I'm going to be stressed out. If I think about my mom dying, I'm going to be stressed out, right? And those things manifest themselves in the body internally. And, when we can gain awareness of how we're feeling physically, that allows us to really start to notice whether these stories are real and the impact that they're actually having on us.
Yeah, that's well said. That's well said. And I hope we can come back at some point in this conversation about integrating the mind and the body and being more present to that. Because I also believe that that's a challenge point for many of us. And we're not quite in tune with our bodies based on these modern lives that we're living. We'll come back to that. Let's put a pin in that, as they would say. So let me ask you another open-ended, broad question, just so that all of us here listening are on the same page. So we're using the right terms. And when I say thoughts, are they true? We all can kind of conceptually agree to that principle. And the next question then is, why are stories so powerful, period? Like, why are they so powerful to us as humans?
Well, they're constantly running in the background or the foreground, right? So if something is always there, and I'm using the word always very, very intentionally, right? Things are rarely always one way or another, but if a story is there and it's running, it can be powerful, right? And what makes up a story? Words and breath, right? Words plus breath equal a story, and those stories create our identity. And those stories and identity create our reality that we find ourselves in. And so why that makes us so powerful is or why that makes stories so powerful is, the old adage, if you believe it, you can achieve it. If you think you can, you can. If you think you can't, you can't. And both those people are right. You can talk yourself into a bad mood really easily, or at least I can. I know a lot of people can. Turns out you can talk yourself out of a bad mood into a good mood just as easily if you know the right words, if you're running the right stories. And so stories, words, breath dictate our reality because they are the building blocks, the DNA, if you will, of that reality. And if those things are running amok or running rampant in the wrong ways, it can lead to a very unsatisfactory, potentially even very painful reality.
Yeah, I think we can all align with that sentiment.
And sometimes those negative, painful stories are true. Maybe you are exhibiting traits of laziness. Maybe you did make a mistake and really drop the ball and mess up. But does that mean that you are a mistake? No. Does that mean that, oh, you're the biggest POS in the world now? Like, no. Stories, just because they're positive doesn't make them right. Just because they're negative doesn't make them right. But it is important to check in with the body and understand, what these stories are doing for ourselves. Are they helping build us? Are they architecting our reality in the way that we want? Or are they tearing us down? Are they creating conflict? And there are patterns of words, patterns of language. When I say language, I don't mean like English, French, Spanish. I mean patterns of words in whatever language you're speaking that can lead us down that path of conflict or lead us down that path of architecting the reality that we are seeking for ourselves.
Wonderful. And I want you to go there in just a moment, but I feel like I just need to continue to check in with our listeners. So when we think of story, we think of once upon a time. And I don't think that's exactly what we're talking about here. Let me give you an example of what I would describe as a story, a thought that I might have. Here's what I would describe as a story. And I just think it's important for us to, all of us here, just to really get aligned with these definitions. The story is, this podcast is going to fail. Doesn't sound like an interesting story. It's one sentence, but I think that's a story.
If that's something that's running in your head, if that's a thought that you have that repeats itself, that creates an emotional response, is that any different internally for you than this podcast is going to be a success?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. And just because you repeat this podcast is going to fail, doesn't mean it's going to fail. Right. And similarly, just because you repeat this podcast is going to be a success, doesn't mean it's going to be a success. Right. But those two things tend to, if you played out 1,000 iterations of those, they will tend to follow those particular paths.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess for me, Dave, what I'm checking in on with you is this notion that, so I have this thought, this podcast is going to fail, which, by the way, it's not necessarily something I believe, but I just thought it'd be a good example.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me is a story. It's made up. I'm talking about a future that hasn't happened.
Mm-hmm.
It's a story to me.
Stories can be past, present, or future. I think the present stories are the ones that, hey, okay, this is the state that I am in. The past stories are the ones that can keep us stuck or potentially are hurtful or haunting, right? Those things that we've experienced in our lives. Changing those stories can give the greatest sense of satisfaction, relief, clarity, lightness, etc. Because what we're able to do is change the relationship to the thing that we've experienced. We obviously can't go back in time and change it, but we can change how we relate to that thing now. So shifting the story, changing the story, working the story allows us to, again, shift those emotions and then come to that present sense with potentially a different identity. Most likely having processed a lot of the things that are still remaining internally inside of us as remnants of the things that we've experienced.
Yeah. So I'm reflecting on what you're sharing here, and what I keep thinking, Dave, is I may have more agency over my life and the stories in my head than I previously thought.
You very well may. Self-talk acknowledged.
Well, I know you do this story work with clients, and I'm going to tee it up to you to kind of guide me through how you want to navigate this discussion itself. Do you want to walk me through a process? Do you want to share some of your insights on how we can check in with our stories? Doors open.
Cool. Well, let's kind of start with a couple areas that I would start.
Yeah.
Right? So if someone comes to me to work their stories, they hire me to be their coach, to be their story work coach. They typically fall in one of two categories. Okay. Maybe one of three categories. The first is, I'm stuck. I don't know what to do. There's some indecision. Kind of think of that, should I stay or should I go career-wise? Should I stay or should I go relationship-wise? I'm unhappy. I haven't been able to build momentum, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Most of the time what's happening there is a present day story running, and that individual's language patterns probably are negative. They might be experiencing imposter syndrome. They are most certainly stuck in the victim mentality. I will give the definition of the victim mentality just because I have it off the top of my head at ready. The victim mentality is an acquired personality trait whereby an individual tends to regard himself or herself as the victim of the negative actions of others, even in the absence of clear evidence. The victim mentality depends on a habitual thought process and attributions. Okay? So a lot of people are stuck. They want to get unstuck. Cool. No problem. The second category of people that come to me are folks who are extremely hurt or have experienced things that are haunting. Hurt being that thing that somebody said to you when you were 11 that you never forgot about, losing a parent or a loved one, some sort of tragedy in that capacity, maybe a divorce, things like that. The haunted is the worst stuff of the humankind and human condition, the terrible things that people do experience. And if someone has experienced that and is wanting to free themselves from the feelings that are associated with those hurt or haunting experiences, then we can work that story through the same process we work a story if you were simply stuck, or if you were annoyed, or if we wanted to do something in the future, which is that third thing that people come to me for, is, hey, I want to do this thing. I'd like to get creative. Let's architect this. I already have created the space. Let's build something, or I want to build something. Like, help me do that, right? But the process is the same. If we can title a story and get it written down, we can story work it. We can 4-step it. That process entails, again, 4 steps, and it's simple. This is not rocket science, right? But it is very different from therapy. It's very different from journaling. It's very different from a lot of these other healing modalities, right? Or personal development modalities. So the first step is to title a story and write it down. So top of the steps, the title of the story, top of the steps, might not mean anything to you. I know exactly what that means, right? I know exactly where that means. I can put myself back there, 7 years old, top of the steps. I have a story associated with, quote, the top of the steps, right? So title a story, write it out conversationally, just like you were telling it to somebody. When I was 6 years old, right? Second step is to read that story out loud. And most of the time, people are going to read it like this. They're going to fly through it, go really, really fast, and not want to feel anything, not want to feel the emotions, not want to, it's the same way that they've told that story before. It's the same way that they've experienced that thing. There's an upregulation to them. There's a stress associated with this particular event or story or whatever it may be, right? So the third step is we get them to slow it down, big time. We aren't going to read that at a robotic pace, but we are going to significantly lower the pace so that we can actually start to see the various aspects of this story. We put in the pauses, we put in the breaks. We can actually start to feel those things because we're starting to downshift, right? Not only that, but we're also familiarizing ourselves with this thing. This might be the first time you've done anything more than thought about it and tried to shove it down in a way or disassociate or, distract. Since writing down might be the first time you've done anything different than that, right? And so now we've read it out loud. Now we've read it out loud again, slower. And that fourth step is every comma and period, we're going to add a big diaphragmatic breath, a volume in through the nose and a length out through the mouth. And if repeated, that will pull us down into the parasympathetic rest and relax nervous system state. So you can talk about that thing that you're stuck in, or talk about that thing that was so hurtful, or talk about that thing that haunted you for so long. And now you're able to relate to it, but instead of being stressed out, now you're calm, or at least calmer. You've already moved some of the emotion. You've already familiarized yourself with it. And this allows people to, once we're in that parasympathetic state, actually heal, actually process emotions, actually file and store memories, actually recall memories. This is how, when we sleep, when we fall into deep sleep, we're in that parasympathetic state, right? And so in order to heal, we have to rest. And in a sense, what we're allowing those stories to do is rest, air out, rest, etc. And then an unofficial fifth step is we can go in there and start to check for accuracy, start to change some words, start to write a different script, write a different story.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. And I'm glad you brought it full circle, because early in our discussion, when you were defining what a story is, you mentioned breath. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I'm sure that wasn't just a slip of the tongue. and now I'm starting to get it.
I mean, quite frankly, the breath is the meat and the potatoes of the meal. Right? All the other stuff is the salad and the appetizers, right? But the breath is everything here because, if we box breathe, for example, for 1 minute, my voice will drop a full octave. I will totally downshift. My heart rate may drop 15, 20 beats per minute. I'm going to just calm down, right? And so it's science. Alternatively, if I do for the next minute, I'm going to be very upregulated. I'm going to be stressed out, right? And so our breath really dictates everything. But if we're adding words that we know the meaning of, the definition of a spell, word or collection of words of great influence. How do you build words? Through spelling, right? So when we speak, we are casting spells. In fact, magic spells. And so, what are we saying about ourselves to ourselves? What are we saying, internally and externally? And are we stressing ourselves out or calming ourselves down with our breath? I can breathe low and slow and say I hate myself over and over, and that doesn't really help, but shifting that narrative, okay, I love myself. Now I'm breathing low and slow, and I've got that on repeat. Whether I believe it or not, that's going to change something internally in my body. And if I can repeat that process, I can start to move away from that space where I hated myself and start to move towards that space where I love myself. And this is just an example, but it is very important to notice the words that we're using and how we're breathing, because that can dictate our current state.
Absolutely. I can imagine some of our listeners are reflecting on their stories of the past, their stories of the future, and this podcast is about life as a whole unit, but really with an emphasis on our business life journey. And my bias and belief, Dave, is that our business lives are these golden opportunities for us to transcend the past. That in the arena of creating something incredible or furthering our lives and careers, being able to have more abundance for ourselves and for our families and others, it becomes, in many ways, spiritual work. Even if you don't identify as spiritual or you're like, my job is totally not spiritual. It's the inner work that becomes the spiritual component.
And most people are very poor at compartmentalizing.
Yeah.
A lot of people think they're great at multitasking. Science says you're not. Sorry. Same with compartmentalizing. So I had a client who was a professional Major League Baseball pitcher. He met for drinks. We had a mutual friend up in New York City a year and a half, 2 years ago. We were kind of going back and forth. It's now 12 p.m. or 12 a.m. rather. We've gotten back to the apartment where we've got the poker cards out. We're playing poker. We're shooting the shit, talking about all the stuff in life and whatnot. And he starts. My client starts talking about a relationship that he had, a 9 or 10 year relationship with a woman back home. It had just ended. He was feeling really, really poorly about it, really negative about it. It had actually gone on for a couple months now. And, I asked him, do you ever think about the situation? Do you ever think about her on the mound? Like when you're pitching in a Major League Baseball game in front of 60,000 people? And he said, oh yeah, all the time. And, my next question was, well, does that make you pitch better or worse? And he goes, oh, it's terrible. Like it makes me pitch worse, right? But I can't stop thinking about it. And it's constantly on my mind. And it was just such a great example of how even the greatest of athletes or even the best business owners, right, most successful people are most likely poor at compartmentalizing. And what goes on at work sometimes follows us home. And what goes on at home sometimes follows us to work. And what happened 20 years ago still pops up on a relatively regular basis, et cetera, et cetera. And so when we were able to work together, do a couple sessions, move some of that emotion, change that story, start to shift, find out what was true, what was false, et cetera, that allowed him to be able to get on the mound, if not think about that situation, the double negative there, at the very least have some control over the breath and thought process and some control over what happens next. And what that individual could do, what that guy can do to shift some things in the moment.
Wow.
And he got better at pitching, So.
Wow. Great story. Ha, ha, ha. Uh-huh. But it was great and very illuminating. And I appreciate what you said about the compartmentalization aspect. I think we probably think we're much better at that than we really are. And I wholeheartedly agree. What happens at home will impact work and vice versa. Fast forward to our present moment where so many of us are working from home. Mm-hmm. We don't have the commute. We don't have the office. We don't have the change of scenery.
The separation.
Yeah. So it's an invitation for story. It's an invitation in a good way or a bad way. And I think what you're telling us about is first recognize that there is a story being told. Mm-hmm. Right? It might be a pretty rotten story. It might be a boring story, but it creates stress. You can change the story, but you have to invest to go back into the story.
Totally. Yeah, there's a cost associated with that, and there's a cost associated with getting fit, right? You aren't going to get fit laying on the couch, right? You got to get up and move.
What?
There's a cost associated with getting healthy. There's also a cost associated with getting well. And yet wellness can happen in an instant, whereas fitness and health take time to build. Fitness and health can also be measured. Wellness is totally unmeasurable. But you can be well in an instant by having a different internal dialogue.
Wow, it's interesting. I just had another discussion with a wonderful guest the other day who does a lot of work with the kind of strengths surveys and personality surveys and is very gifted at it. And I've taken quite a few in my day. This is a bit of an aside, so forgive me for the sidebar. But I was just reflecting on those kinds of business surveys, those personality surveys, and there's 1,000 of them, and they're all good, mm-hmm. right? But I've never really liked taking them. And you know why? Because I don't want to hear a story about what I'm good at.
Yeah, who you are and have that defined for you.
Yeah. No, I would much rather decide I'm going to be really great presenting in a sales meeting. Although if you looked at my life up until recently, I was the least likely candidate to be very good at that.
And then you changed your habits and your actions and applied it consistently over time, and things started to shift.
Yeah. And I do think, and I didn't know this at the time, but it was more of an intuitive gesture. I changed the story. Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm not good at this. I could be really good at this. Mm-hmm. I'm not good like he is. Well, I'm not him. Mm-hmm. I am me. I'm a little bit different.
I got my human design read by a human design expert the other day. Similar to astrology, I had it jokingly referred to as like astrology for bros. But for those interested, I'm a 3-5 generator, and I don't necessarily read too far into that. But what that did for me was it allowed me to recognize the things that were reflected back to me in myself and start to see, as I'm learning about 3-5 generators and, what that supposedly means and how that relates to me personally, it gave me, or I gave myself through that more permission to be me. And I think that's so important is I was actually just listening to a podcast with Aaron Rodgers, the quarterback of the Green Bay Packers, and Aubrey Marcus. And in the very 5 minutes of the podcast, Aubrey says, "Hey man, having an athlete of your stature on the show coming and talking about, real life stuff is wild. Why are you here?" And he says, to give a permission slip to other people to be themselves, because that's what I did, and it changed my life. He goes on to say all the self-doubt he used to have, all the self-loathing he used to have, and loving myself has been the greatest gift. And this is Aaron Rodgers talking. I might as well be saying this as well. Like, loving myself has been the greatest gift to me in my career and everything else. And that came from a limiting belief of, prior than that, I didn't love myself, So changing the story can do everything for somebody, and it can totally shift the narrative and shift the reality. That sidebar, go back to that sidebar for me.
Yeah. Oh, geez. You expect me to remember what we were talking about?
Well, I was hoping you would, because I had a point and then I forgot it.
Well, I just popped some mushrooms here about 30 minutes ago. I'm starting to peak. Just kidding.
JK.
Well, we were talking about, I had said my bias was I just didn't want to be told who I was. And that's a little bit of my chip on my shoulder, although with all due respect to these surveys that I've taken, they've all been very helpful to me. And so that's just my own thing. But I think the larger piece to all this, and I love that story about Aaron Rodgers. I love it, by the way, because when I like a story that a sports person says or tells that I can relate to, I like it because I'm not a big sports person. So that was good. I think what I keep coming back to, Dave, is this message from you to embrace your story, to not hold it at arm's length anymore.
Embrace it and write it yourself. Rewrite it.
Mm.
What do the things that you've experienced in the past mean about you now? Are you the same person you were at 5 years old, 10 years old, 5 years ago, last year? No. Like, we can define ourselves. Identity is very fluid. I don't identify as a power lifter anymore, though for 5 years, that's all I cared about, being a strength athlete, getting better at it. But I don't identify as that anymore. In the beginning, it was hard for me to even identify as a story worker. And now I know and I identify as, and I've stepped into and embodied the identity of a world-class story worker.
Mm.
And that didn't happen just because I repeated it over and over and over again. That happened because I set the goal, did the reps, and maintained that story. I knew what I wanted to do, and I began working towards that thing and talking myself into it,
Yeah.
That, I think, is the key is to bring it home is we have the ability to write our own story. You are not only the screenwriter, you're also the director, and you're also the antagonist, and you also happen to be the protagonist as well. And so you, listener, are the one holding you, listener, back. I am the one holding me back, period. That doesn't mean that people don't experience being victimized. That doesn't mean that people don't go through hard things or have different cards that are dealt, and we can move on from those things. We can heal from those things. Human beings are remarkably resilient. And if you're listening to this, you're still here. So you can shift that story and you can take control over that narrative and write a new play, write a new movie.
Right. Write your future. Write your story.
Mm-hmm.
Own it.
And you got to clear the space to do that. If you want to build something new, you got to demolish the house first before you can build a new house in that same place. Right?
Yeah. I think metaphysically, when we talk about demolishing, what we're saying is be open to the possibility that when you go back to revisit that story, it may not have actually been the real story. We've created identities over a long period of time about what's happened to us. But with the right guide like yourself, and with the right spirit and intention, which is what you've just been sharing about making space, you might go back in time and realize, oh, it wasn't what I thought it was. Or it doesn't mean what I think it used to mean up until the day before yesterday.
For sure. And that's the most likely one in that scenario is you don't have to believe everything you think or say.
It all comes full circle. That's a good way to close it. But before we do, I just want to quickly honor you, Dave. I've known you for years. When I made the decision to get back into fitness, I had put on a lot of weight through my divorce. I was in bad shape, and you came to my aid, and you put together a plan that was, I said, scare me, Dave, and you frightened me half to death. And ever since then, and that's been years now, you've just been by my side, and I've watched you grow and evolve and change your story over and over again. Opportunities come your way. Opportunities closed in front of you. You were stuck in Mexico during COVID. You managed to get out, and yet you kept finding your way forward. And that courage and that focus is honorable, and it's inspiring. And I'm just very grateful that you're my friend.
I appreciate you greatly, brother. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Yeah, appreciate it. Dave took us back to what I call the scene of the crime, to the stories of our past that are holding us back today. I encourage you to return to that discussion with Dave and step through his guided approach to rewriting your stories. And make sure to visit welcomemisfit.com for this episode's notes and how you can connect with Dave. Right now, though, I want to teach you how to spot the stories that are holding you back right now, the stories you're literally telling yourself right now. Remember when I shared that we are hardwired for stories? That's really, really important to remember because we tell ourselves stories all the time. Stories that we'll never make it, that we're not good enough, the future's going to suck. And even if there's just a little bit of truth to any of these stories, they're still made up. They're still stories. Yet because stories are so addictive to our minds, we get swept away by them. We actually begin believing these stories and forget to ask the simple question, am I just telling myself a story? So I want you to learn how to spot the stories you're telling yourself so you can retrieve yourself before getting swept away in dumpster fire thinking. Now, there are 3 stories that stress us out the most. Stress story number 1, the reading minds story. Stress story number 2, the predicting the future story. And stress story number 3, the arguing with reality story. So let's start by exploring the first story, the reading minds story. This is the story you tell yourself about what somebody's intentions are. As in, Carol completely sandbagged me in the meeting because she's out to get me. That's a story. Carol may have said something you didn't like in the meeting, but when you begin reading Carol's mind and assuming ill intent, you make up a story. Because you can't read minds. And that story kicks up other stories about how other people are out to get you, stories that you'll never get a fair break, stories that you always have to watch your back. That's stress story number 1, reading minds. Stress story number 2, the predicting the future story. The moment you realize you're imagining a future that hasn't happened yet, it's a story. How do I know? Because it's the future. You have no idea what's going to happen. Daydreaming about your desired future state? Cool, wonderful. It clarifies where you want to go and why it's worth the effort and sacrifice. What I'm concerned about now for you is spotting when you tell yourself a story about a negative future that hasn't happened yet. Because when you tell yourself the predicting the future story, you get swept away by negativity. You lose hope, confidence, and we need you to be whole and complete, not stressed, not worried, not anxious. And the final stress story, the story where we argue with reality. So what does that story look like? Something happens you don't like a deal goes south, you get an unexpected bill, client changes their mind, and you lose out on an opportunity. Now, that might be reality, but what you and I often do next is a story. When we begin to argue with reality, we begin telling ourselves, this shouldn't have happened, this isn't fair, why me, I can't catch a break. That's arguing with reality. That's a story that always leads to a negative ending for you and me. Now, I've argued with reality so much that I am a master storyteller. But you know what? It never helps. It only makes things worse when you argue with reality. Because we slide into resentment. We begin to think our luck will never improve, that the next shoe's just about to drop. We start looking for evidence that we're on a losing streak. So we get stuck, our confidence droops, our problem-solving abilities diminish, and we tell ourselves stories, more stories, and begin looking for more evidence that those negative stories are true. Talk about a vicious cycle. Instead, spot the story. Catch yourself. Ask yourself, am I telling myself a story about reading a person's mind and that I know their intention? Ask yourself, am I telling myself a story about a future that hasn't happened yet? Ask yourself, am I telling myself a story where I am arguing with reality instead of just dealing with what it is in a neutral, calm way? Now it's your turn. See how quickly you can spot the stress stories you're telling yourself about others' intentions, about the future, about what is. Ask yourself, am I telling myself a stress story? As my mindfulness teacher Peter used to say to me, the goal is to retrieve yourself moment to moment, to not get swept away by our mind's stories. So you can return to yourself, fully present, and focus on the reality at hand. So you can take action with a fresh, calm perspective, which is the best energy for making things happen. And when you bring positive or even neutral energy to your life and work, You create the conditions that lead to the best shot at your success, which ultimately can lead to moments that someday may become great stories, the kind you'll want to relive and share with others. The Business of Being is a production of Band of Misfits, your business life mentors. Come say hello at welcomemisfit.com. And while you're there, grab your copy of Misfits Microdoses, our email with drops of inspiration and insights to help you navigate your business life journey.
The show's executive producer is me, Sir Isaac Smith. We want this show to help as many people as possible on their business life journey. Would you help spread the word? Share this episode with a friend on social media, and please leave us a review. Every little bit helps.
So, Sir Isaac, if I may ask, this is kind of a personal question, I find, but I'm curious, do you have a mantra or something that you remind yourself?
I do, and ironically enough, Haley Thomas, one of your earlier guests, she taught this one to me. It was born out of a situation where, I have this business, I have my process down, I have my package, now I just need the clients. And that was daunting. And I was talking with her about it one day, and she took a look at the business, and then she said, what would help you is probably to recite a mantra. Just sit down and tell yourself, I have everything I need to get the next client. Objectively, she was right. I have all the resources. I have the call list if I need to call people. I have the network. I have the referrals. I have everything I need to solve this problem. And so now, as I face new situations and new opportunities, I just rephrase that mantra, but the spirit is still the same. I have everything I need to solve this problem.
Now your mantra is, I have everything I need to figure out how to get all this incredible work done. All right. That's
great. It's a good problem to have. Yep.
That's excellent. I love that mantra. It's so true. We are always whole and complete. Always.
Well, I know that you have to have a mantra. If you don't mind me asking you, what is Stephen's mantra?
Well, I have about 2,042 mantras, depending on what I need to remind myself. That is true, but I'll share one with you because I know we've had conversations about workaholicism, and for me, a recovering type A control freak. I created a mantra a while back because I was in a season of my life, Sir Isaac, where I was doing so much to create so much, and I was doing my utmost to be as present and available to everybody in my life, which I was glad to do. But it was coming at a cost. It was coming at an energetic cost. And I found myself at the end of the day, when the work was done, my body, my mind, my energy was still so amped up, so ramped up, that I needed to calm myself. I needed to kind of find my grounding again. So I created a mantra, and those of you who know Misfits and know me know that I have a dog named Ollie, a 15-pound Woodle, and we'll walk every day. And so as I would walk Ollie and find myself needing to kind of ground myself and to return to myself, I started saying this phrase, this mantra: nothing to do, nowhere to go, no one to be. Nothing to do, nowhere to go, no one to be. In other words, I had to remind myself, I don't have to go anywhere. I can just be here. I don't have to do anything. I can just be. And that last line is so odd, but no one to be. Because I think in life, especially I find as I work with women, they're just all of these identities to all these people. I'm a mom, I'm a business leader, I'm this, I'm that. Sometimes we have to remind myself, I don't have to be anyone right now. I can just be here, be my spirit, my soul, the eternal. So that's a mantra that has been a game changer for me.
I could really see that being a good supplement to workaholism, to recovering workaholics.
Yes, because when you get wound up in that energy state, it's hard to unwind that. Especially, oh gosh, Sir Isaac, especially if it works. Then now it's an addiction because it's worked. And you have to supplement that energetic, wired state with the alternative state, which is presence, calmness, equanimity. Why don't you take us home, Sir Isaac?
For show notes, links, and behind-the-scenes shenanigans, visit welcomemisfit.com and click podcast. Until then, don't fit in, stand out.